Are you tired of wasting your time on print-related tickets? PrinterLogic offers a centralized, cloud-native, IP-based print management system. Dump your print servers and discover the future of print management with PrinterLogic. Find out more and get a free 30-day trial at printerlogic.com/packetpushers.
Welcome to Heavy Strategy, where we explore the issues around inspiring, building, and maintaining enterprise IT strategy. It's pretty hard to inspire anything about IT strategy, but we're going to try. Our process starts with asking quality questions instead of just any question, and then taking opposing views on the answers, just like, if you've ever had consultants around, the way the consultants dive into a topic that's how they work. Questions don't need answers. That's your job. Today's episode is circular. We've just talked about questions and questioning the questions, but how do you ask questions? Does that matter? Does that sound odd? Is there a right way to ask questions, or to frame questions, or to think of questions, or to question the questions? Johna, this is actually your wheelhouse. You're one of these people who's got a lot more structure about their process, and you've got a lot of research behind what you're doing. Where do you think we need to start with this one?
Well, first of all, I'm chuckling because it's absolutely true that consultants try to ask leading questions. We love to do that. That said, it is actually really important to ask the right questions, and the question that you're asking here is, what are the right questions? So I want to kick off this notion that one of the very, very important things to do in IT strategy is to ask why, and not just once, but multiple times. And this can be at any level. So, for example, we're working with a client right now, and later today we're going to go into a deep discussion that essentially involves asking, this is your architecture, why are you doing it that way? The next question after that is, have the reasons, the factors that led for this, have any of them changed from then till now, or will they change in the near future? So then the next question is what would cause them to change? So basically, why are you doing what you're doing? What might change what you're doing now? And then keep going. And one of the best frameworks for continuing to dig into what you're doing to get to the real root cause of something is an approach that was coined by the Japanese, who, as you know, have an obsession with getting processes correct and corrector and corrector. They sort of asymptotically approach perfection, Six Sigma and all that. And the approach is called the 5 whys. Basically, it goes like this. Let's say some user made a mistake with data entry or whatever, and it caused a system to crash or a customer to be disappointed, right? So the first question you ask is, why did they do that? And of course, the answer is always, they look at you funny and say they made a mistake, right? Humans do that. But no, really, why did they make the mistake? Why did they enter that data in that field instead of the other field? Oh, well, it was located too close. The two fields were located too close together. And the person just literally couldn't distinguish these two tiny little fields from each other. Well, why did we locate those two fields so close to each other? And again, you're going to get a funny look. Well, obviously, the user interface people didn't know what they were doing. Well, not necessarily. Maybe they packed them together because they were told that they had to put all this extraneous information on the same screen.
Somebody told them they wanted everything on one page. Yeah,
exactly.
Instead of
Okay, so why did they want everything on one page? Well, because, 15 years ago, people were having trouble realizing that they could click through and find this piece of information, which, by the way, no longer is relevant. That was 15 years ago, and so forth and so on. You get the idea. So at the end root cause may be to redesign the page, but not to just move blindly and stupidly move these two fields apart, but actually to say, oh, we really have way too much information here for our current processes. We don't need this stuff. This is a 15-year-old design. We can fix it to make it easier so we don't make those mistakes. Now, user interfaces are the easy way to talk about 5 whys, but it's also true across the board in infrastructure. One of the great questions is, why do we have to do the hairpin turn for our traffic flow? Why does everything from a remote office have to come all the way back to the central enterprise and then go out again? Why are we doing that? Oh, well, for security reasons, we have to funnel it through the firewall. Well, what has changed in the firewall universe that maybe we don't have to do that hairpin anymore, and so forth and so on. But the point is, most people, especially in IT, feel like asking why is anathema. You're not allowed to do it. And part of the reason is because we're socialized that IT's job is to take orders. We can be creative as to how we take orders, but our job is to take those orders, deliver the users what they want, deliver senior management what they want, and sit in a corner and be quiet. And the truth is, yes, but no. I mean, certainly our existence is to further the business drivers, the business goals of the organization we're part of. That much is true. But blindly taking orders is a terrible idea because most of the people who are giving the orders don't understand what we do.
Yeah.
And therefore, asking why is really important because it gets at the core intent of the people running the organization.
I think of it slightly different. You're talking about getting to intent, and I think a lot of your topics of the whys is to get to the understanding meaning, the business meaning. Now, business meaning is a very soft topic, right? Because it always ends up at make a profit, spend less.
I don't agree that it's soft at all, but keep going.
Right. I think the 5 whys is it's a kind of a childish approach, right? When you say the 5 whys, it's what I call, self-help books for kindergartners. All of those self-help books you see on the store, these 5 principles will change your life, and you read them and you think that could have been a 1,000-word blog post rather than a book. But anyway.
It doesn't need to be a book, but it is actually very important to live that way.
Right. But now, because of the way my brain works, the 5 whys, you ask why 5 times. What I'm drilling into is what I think of as points of invariance. What I'm trying to find is this idea of where are the factors that cannot be changed or will not be changed. I don't care why they aren't changed. I care less about why they can't change or won't change. I care that they become fixed points in a consulting engagement, because one of the challenges in a design or a strategy or a consulting engagement is that you need to have a starting point on which to work on, right?
Right. You can't do absolutely everything. You're not allowed to recreate the universe. So what are the limits?
Yes. So the simplest example of that is you come into the site and you get some ideas and, you do some you ask some whys about what's the problem that you're having. And then you'll start coming across what I think of as, again, points of invariance, which is we are committed to this vendor. We have a long-standing relationship and nothing you can do will change our relationship away from this vendor. We are committed to this technology. So if you are going to attack those points of invariance where the clients,
wasting your time.
You're either wasting your time or you're going to make a major transition. You're going to be betting your reputation inside of that consulting agreement. Because then you're going to say, like, okay, well, now what we need to do is have a crisis meeting because this point of invariance or, this immutable thing or whatever is the problem. And you're now going to have to address that head on. You're not going to be able to, as a consultant, work around it, right? So I see the 5 whys asking questions as always looking for points of invariance. So where is it that the customers wants to change, willing to change? Where is it that they're open to investigation? What is it that they don't know? But the points of invariance are, we want this technology, we want this brand, we're going to follow this trend, and these become absolutes. And I used to just have a heading in my engagement documents, that process where you start out, which just said, points of invariance. And it would say, you told me that these things can't change. And when I wrote them down in black and white, guess what would happen to them?
They'd say, wait, that's not
what we said.
No.
I said, well, hang on. We were in the meeting and you said we will absolutely only buy brand X of a commitment, or this technology is absolutely the foundation.
Of course, we know what brand X is here in this in this show, but we're not going to mention
anybody. It could be any brand, right? Oracle or whatever, right? It could go the other way too. It might say, like, we're trying to get out of this vendor, so we want anything but this vendor, right? Or we want anything but this technology. And so I always just put them down up front. And they actually, in a weird kind of a way, it was one of the most useful tools, because when you put down the standing assumptions that everybody inside of an organization,
everybody signs off on, and I do think that's a very, very good question to ask, which is, what are the points of invariance? Although you don't walk into the meeting saying what are the points of invariance.
Yeah, so then it comes down to how do you ask the questions? How do you reach that?
Right.
Because, and I guess really I'm focused on the exploratory phase of an engagement, or a process where you're, trying to write a strategy, trying to work on a design, come up with some recommendations, review and make recommendations. Like when you're brought in to look at these things, what I'm always trying to get to is points of, this is a hard, I've hit the wall. This is the wall. Okay, great.
This cannot change, so that now that, it's just a limiting parameter for solving the problem. Full stop. Let's move on. And I'll just highlight that for anyone who's listening, that essentially, if you've listened this far, thank you. And you've learned about the 5 whys and points of invariance. But before we move on, I want to highlight 2 things. First of all, I don't entirely agree with Greg in terms of the output. In other words, I don't believe that there should be points of invariance for nonsensical reasons, like we love brand X or whatever. Yeah. And the reason is I've had too many cases where I've walked into a client and have them tell me under no circumstances will we move to public cloud. And then during the course of the engagement, have them move to public cloud. So I walk in and say, that's nice. I'm glad you give me that as your point of invariance. And just to be safe, we're going to make a plan that in case somebody somewhere changes their mind, which they do. But the second thing is much more interesting that I want to point out, because we've been doing some navel gazing here at Heavy Strategies and at Packet Pushers generally. And somebody asked what the show is about. And I realized that there's an underpinning to this show, which has to do with our slants towards the universe. And if you listen closely, the point of view that Greg has is that nothing really makes sense. The people in charge are going to do stupid things for stupid reasons. And your job as a technologist is to navigate your way safely through all of this, deliver as much of what they ask for as can be done. But in reality, just acknowledge that you're living in a world that is stupid, irrational, and may at times try to exploit you.
It's an imperfect world, and only imperfect solutions can emerge from an imperfect world.
Exactly. And over at my side of the house, you'll notice a constant thread of, no, wait, there's a nice rational approach and people will behave rationally and do the right things for the right reasons. Now, we all know, now that we've said that, we all know that the real world is a mix of the 2 things. Unfortunately, Greg's world probably predominates, and most of you are listening going, yeah, that's my life. She just captured it. But there are enough cases where if you sit down and you literally have a meaningful conversation saying, why are you not moving to the cloud? You get an answer that's not based on, well, so-and-so salesperson has got me locked in and is giving me kickbacks or whatever stupid reason might be there. So I just want to highlight that, because as you listen to me and to Greg discuss and debate, keep in mind that we've got different core frames of reference, which are probably personality traits for all I know.
Well, that comes back to what we've talked about before. All of your consultants are a product of their experience.
Exactly.
So if you bring in somebody who's a 30-year-old who's got 5 years practical experience after being a trainee journeyman.
Well, don't do that, okay?
Yeah, no.
Just don't.
But equally so, if you bring in somebody who's 5 years off retirement, their viewpoints might also be a product of their era. I'll never forget the time I was working with somebody and they committed to a storage strategy which was 20 years old. And they said, I think my favorite story perhaps in that era was I was once talking to somebody who worked for a big, large financial institution, and he just deployed a brand new data center network. This was right on the cusp of when the new 2-tiered CLOS software operated. It was clear that was going to be the future, right? That idea of a 2-tier and scale out and all that. And he just spent $20 million buying a spanning tree, fundamentally a spanning tree design, right? And I said to him, that doesn't really take into account the future. He said, look, you need to understand. First of all, I'm 5 years away from retirement. He said, I want something that I can run for 5 years with the minimum amount of stress. That is the first thing, just between you and me, right?
Right.
He shall remain nameless. I don't even remember his name or what he looked like at this point, but it's a great story. And he said, the second thing is that this absolutely has to work. He said, I agree with you that, yes, the long-term future is around these, the emerging technologies of 2-tier or 3-tier class and, Ethernet over IP and VXLAN and all that sort of stuff. He said, but I can't wait for them to mature and become stable. That's 5 years away. So I'm going to go with what I know, what my team knows, what my processors know. That is a case of, again, an invariant point. That is very sound logic, right?
And that is legit. That's what I was going to say. And I've seen the same thing happen in security where people are afraid to move, and I say afraid to move to zero trust, because literally I'm 5 years away from retirement. Why should the end of my career be marked with a risky move that makes me look extremely stupid if I fail? And if I just do the safe, tried and true thing and buy a bigger, better firewall, it may not be this huge fireworks of applause and great job, but I go out safely, get my pension, whatever.
Yeah, let's just respect that people are people. And, when we talk about an imperfect world, sometimes imperfection just comes from perfectly normal, everyday things.
And that's not even imperfection. I want to just hammer that point one more time and then toss out a suggestion to listeners. One of the things to really understand on that point is sometimes it's okay to go with heirloom technology, as Greg likes to call it. I remember several years ago at my own company, we were having the trials of the damned with freaking Microsoft, crashing everything because we were a highly distributed company. And at the time, this was way before Office 365, Microsoft was just not set up to operate across a WAN. And so I pulled a guy who covered collaboration and I said, hey, Erwin, the only solution out there at the current moment, like this Google thing is looking kind of interesting, but the only thing that's working today is Lotus Notes. I mean, and everybody was like, oh, my God, Lotus Notes is blast from the past. I said, listen, make a prediction. How much longer are we going to get out of Lotus Notes? And he said, I can give you 3 years max. I said, fine, we're switching to Lotus Notes. So we transitioned from Microsoft to Lotus Notes. Our support costs dropped to almost zero because it didn't crash the WAN anymore. And we were perfectly functional and we got 5 years out of it. So sometimes the stupid decision is actually the right decision. Right.
Let's pause the conversation for a word from sponsor Printer Logic. Remember how the future was going to be paperless? Yeah, not so much. And where there's paper, there's printers and print servers. If you're tired of dealing with print-related tickets, Printer Logic offers a simple, scalable, cloud-native, centralized, direct IP printing platform. Connect your print environment to easily manage front and back-end printing, integrate with EMR and ERP solutions, and get visibility and security. Say goodbye to print servers and reduce print tickets by up to 90% with Printer Logic. Find out more and get a free 30-day trial at printerlogic.com/packetpushers. That's printerlogic.com/packetpushers. And now back to the podcast.
All right. Thanks for listening through that ad. Let's keep going. Johnny, you were going to pick up the conversation.
And I would say I want to circle back to the whole question of the 5 whys and where you apply them to as well, because this is a thing where I see people stumbling on a lot. And I actually go through this exercise with pretty much any of the clients that I work with to develop a strategy. And we've talked about this before, but you really want to lead with the business drivers, which lead you to technology principles. Before I talk about the technology principles, the business drivers, Greg, you said basically we want to make a lot of money. Well, that's not necessarily true. In some cases, if you're a not-for-profit, you don't really care, although even not-for-profits care. In some cases, it's much more important to make money in a certain way. So it's a good idea to drive down into the details of the business drivers. So, for example, a public company may be focused heavily on driving share price up because either the senior executives have a lot of stock, they're planning to sell the company, whatever it is. And that's important because there's certain metrics that Wall Street's going to look at, and they may affect IT. They may be meaningless metrics, but it doesn't matter. Those metrics have to look good. So making these metrics, whether they're meaningful or meaningless, look good is a business driver. Another business driver is, you know what? We're comfortable with the amount of money we make. We're comfortable with our growth rate. We just want to make the same amount of money at less cost. Well, that would lead you to reducing operating costs, and you can immediately translate that to an IT set of decisions because you want to make everything you buy, everything you put together easy to operate, cheap to operate, constantly push down the operating costs. Or alternatively, you may say, I want to shift from capital intensive. Capital's gotten really expensive. I want to be operationally intensive. So that just tells you, move everything you possibly can out to cloud, for example. So another meaningful business driver is we want to grow by acquisition. Well, that means you can't lock yourself into some sort of rigid IT environment where every time you buy a new company, you have to completely convulse and rip out all their infrastructure and put in your rigid infrastructure. You have to have a nice modular architecture that allows you to happily and cheerfully integrate dissimilar architectures and support a heterogeneous environment. So these are all, and I've sort of drifted into talking about why it matters, what the business drivers are, but it's really important that you go through this exercise. And by the way, pretty much all of my clients will tell me the business people can't articulate what you just said. We want to increase share price by making metrics go up. We want to reduce operating costs. They can blither blather in their financial reports, which, by the way, have been generated by AI for probably 20 years now. Fun fact. And I actually know somebody who used to make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year writing financial reports, and then the bottom fell out of her business about 20 years ago because they created them all with AI, which is why they're so meaningless and hard to understand. But coming
they're just
back,
regurgitating the same facts. It's like reading computer-generated news articles, assuming they're accurate, of course. But
yeah, well, and they may not even be accurate, which is another fun thing, but never mind that. But the point is, you as an IT person need to at least tease out what's going on, and you need to go through this exercise because obviously growing, there's a huge difference between somebody who says we want to grow by acquisition and we want to reduce operating costs. Because reducing operating costs might tell you, we need a very consistent, standardized infrastructure. Growing by acquisition is like, no, we have to be comfortable with a heterogeneous.
Okay. So I use that. What you're talking about there is discovering what I think of as unknown unknowns. There's
exactly.
generally a cultural expectation, or people I'm mostly talking from the point of view of my experience, where I was coming in as an outsider into an organization with a brief to do something. So I was always on uncertain ground. Nobody really wanted me, like somebody wanted me there, but not necessarily everybody. I was often, people felt challenged or undermined. Very difficult thing to do, by the way, if you ever take on that job. But I was also, so when I talk about points of invariance, finding the points of invariance or the topics of invariance, the other thing you're looking for is discovering unknown unknowns. So what is it that the business believes to be a truth that they don't even know is not a truth or is a truth, right? You're talking about, everybody sort of assumes that businesses exist just to make a profit. It's kind of a byline and a bit of a meme at this particular point, but you're right, they're not. But discovering that inside of a company, when you sit down and talk to the senior executives and you say, what is it that you're about? And they say, well, we actually have a mandate for growth. And you say, well, what about profit? They say, well, as long as profit stays where it is, if we can grow the company by 10%, 20%, that's our current goal. Well, that's an unknown.
That's important to understand. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
If you're in IT, you may not know that because the people at the top are very poor at talking to the people in IT, right? And so if you discover that, you can introduce genuine change. So part of asking questions is finding the unknown unknowns, or the unknown knowns even, standard.
Yeah, they may be unknown to you, but yes. And honestly, I want to highlight a point before we switch topics a little bit. And sort of close this out by talking about how to ask these questions. But what's interesting is the people at the top are not going to tell IT because they don't think it matters. It has not occurred to them that there's a logical connection between their goals and your goals. Yeah. They just assume IT is, in their heart of hearts, even though they understand technology, they assume IT is commoditized and consistent and similar regardless. So they're thinking of their iPhones and they're thinking of electricity, and you guys are the people that generate that. And why should it matter whether I'm using that electricity for, I'm in an office? Okay, obviously, if it's a manufacturing plant versus a data center versus an office, that's a big deal. But if it's an office, why does it matter whether these people are making, mortgages or legal cases, right? And they don't understand that it makes a very big difference in terms of IT, what you do. So that I think is not to fault the business people for poor communication, although that is a legit fault. They're as bad at it as the rest of us. But the other thing is they truly, genuinely don't understand why IT needs to know this stuff. So they don't bother. They really don't bother.
I think that's changing. I mean, when we talk about a lot of companies are beginning to understand that they are technology companies. And part of that transition is that IT is much better aligned with the business. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's true. And so let's transition to kind of the last topic on, asking the right questions, which is how to ask the questions. And Greg, I think you put in a note to yourself to talk about keeping your questions non-personal, non-judgmental, watch out for landmines.
Yeah.
Any further thoughts on that?
Well, you remember what I said? I said often I'm the outsider. And if I come in and suddenly people are hearing my questions as a personal attack on their competence or a personal attack on their decisions, or I'm making judgments about what's happened in the past, you'll generally end up shutting people down. Now, this is a very practical issue, because sometimes you sit there and you go like, oh, really? That was a decision? How could you possibly have chosen that? How could you possibly have reached that decision? And sometimes it'll just come out because it is a moment when you're sitting across from the table, often in an adversarial situation.
Or as I would put it, are you nuts?
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes it just...
So tends not to go well.
Yeah. So, if you're talking to a consultant, that person on the other side of the table may be asking what you think to be hard questions, but they're not. They're just questions, trying to find the things that they need to know, or, the things that they don't know, and work out how to get there. So you have to make sure that you keep your questions. This is where emotional intelligence comes into consulting and advisory services, where you've got to be very careful and tiptoe around the unexploded landmine somewhere in the relationships between the teams. Because so sometimes you come into teams that have been together for 20 years or 10 years, and they've built up this collective knowledge base, and every decision they've made has cumulatively led to the situation that they're in. And they often have personal ownership of those, the decisions and the situation that they're in right now. And you can be so you've got to watch out for questions in certain environments where you can be taken, it can be turned into an emotional minefield.
Yeah, and I think that brings me to one of my favorite topics, which is NTSB rules, which is National Transportation Standards Bureau in the United States. Mm-hmm. And as I understand it, I looked it up once, and I may have forgotten the details, but specifically when there's an accident involving ships or commercial traffic, trucks or trains, the NTSB comes in and does an investigation. And I believe, don't quote me on this, but my understanding is that the findings of that investigation cannot be used in a lawsuit. So if person A wants to sue company B for damages, you can't do it on the grounds of this investigation. And what happens is, what they try to do is to calmly, rationally break down all the things that broke to really do their own version of the 5 whys. And the best example I have of this, actually, it was a weekend exercise that I was doing with the Coast Guard in New York City. And they gave us a wargaming tabletop exercise. It was really a tabletop exercise that had actually happened outside of Australia, as a matter of fact. And a sailboat and a cargo vessel collided. And they broke us into 2 teams. One of us was a cargo vessel, one of us was a sailboat, and they fed us the information based on the case that each of the parties had said they saw. And it was really interesting because you go into it and you think, I'm in the right. I'm the sailboat. Hello, I have right of way. And you go through the exercise and you realize all the information you didn't have and all the wrong conclusions you jumped to based on the information you did have. And the point, then you come to the end and you always, NTSB arrives at a set of recommendations that could be put in place that could preclude accidents like this from happening again. The point was that no matter how emotional you might be in looking at something that has happened, and heck, if people died, that's pretty much the most emotional you can possibly be. You have to step back and say, what caused it? Again, go into the 5 whys. The classic example for this in an IT organization is a cybersecurity incident after action report. You always need to do them. You always need to walk all the way through this and try to pull the emotion out of it, and also make it clear that nobody's getting fired unless there is, literally bad action. We want to understand what happened. We want to understand why.
Unless there's malicious intent.
Unless you were compromised as an insider and you're being paid to hack your own company. Essentially, we want to understand what happened so it won't happen again. And that's super important. And what's weird is most humans hate to do it, because I've implemented that in my companies. We always do an after action report. If the outcome was good, how could it have been better? If it was great, how could it have been superlative? And if it was poor, what could we have done differently? And what's interesting is if you do it calmly, dispassionately, with the understanding that everybody may share some quote unquote blame, everybody relaxes and you can get through it and you can figure out some good practical solutions. But most people think walking into that room that they're just going to get yelled at, and they have a flashback to being 4 years old and who broke the cookie jar.
That was definitely true 30 years ago for IT people who were very much put upon, ignored, and then when mission critical systems went wrong, they were always blamed and abused. And this is sort of a personal view on this. This is much less of a consultant's view. It was certainly true, in my opinion, that 30 years ago when mission critical systems went wrong, people suddenly realized how, especially senior executives, how dependent they were on the technology that they had, right? Especially when the mini computer went down, and everything is on the business. And executives in that era were very much not emotionally aware of the damage that they could do to staff and how it would have negative consequences on them if the staff hated them, right? That's changing now. What we're seeing now is executives are being forced to be aware of the fact that the people that work for them need to want to work for them. and that they need to be taking care. You can't just stand there like a military major yelling at people and telling them what to do and expecting them to do,
It doesn't work in the military either, but that's a longer discussion.
No, but
it turns out that is the least effective way to run an army or a military unit. But that's
it's
a very popular,
yes. Was a very popular mindset, and it's very much declining. So,
well, but I will push back slightly. You don't want to let the pendulum swing too far, and there's a real risk of this right now with, I hate to say it, guys, but millennials and centennials, the Gen Zers, where people's feelings are paramount and you're not allowed to say something that hurts someone's feelings. I was just talking to a colleague who works in a scientific environment, and literally simple things like, I asked you to do this and you didn't do it, can provoke honest to God tears. And it's like, being asked to do the fact that somebody cries after being asked to do their job doesn't mean that being asked to do their job was a wrong question. And I want to close with one example, which is, I worked in an organization at one point where the response to why did this happen was always human error. We're not perfect. And there was a resistance to asking why that error was made, because essentially
that person
any further digging meant I was going to hurt that person's feelings, the person's fluffy feelings. And that was mean. And I was often told that I was mean and not sufficiently empathetic because people's feelings got hurt. And it's like, guys, we're not in kindergarten.
Yes.
We're not in the playground. If your feelings get hurt, that's too bad. But basically, if you trip and fall over, gravity will hurt you.
I'm not here to hurt your feelings, but
reality is reality. Yes.
Yeah,
so you have to be careful that you don't let them off easy when they because the whole "you hurt my feelings" is actually just a form of bullying. And
it is bullying, or it's an attempt to bully from a position of where you're not empowered. So you're attempting to bully back, but it's often a sign of a highly dysfunctional workplace if you find that.
Exactly. So basically there's a I won't say it's a fine line. I think it's a broad open path between being ridiculously, top down blaming on one side and being so afraid to hurt people's feelings.
The power of questions is it exposes those issues. You should be asking questions and you'll suddenly find out, we've got a person who wants to, burst into tears, or we've got a particular person here who's got an alliance with a particular vendor that doesn't, is that the right thing? We've got a technology standard here that hasn't been challenged in 20 years. Is that the right thing?
Exactly.
And so that basically is the power of questions. And, ultimately I often think of questions as basically finding the landmines in a consulting engagement. Ask the question, keep iterating over it until you feel like you've actually gotten to the point of invariance where there's no hidden context or unknown issues affecting the answer.
And the only thing I would add to that, Greg, is when somebody's listening to this, they may at this point be annoyed at the number of times we've referred to consulting. I just want to point out that for all its extents and purposes, IT is always in a consulting relationship to the business. So whether you like to think of it that way or not, the business is your client, you are the consultant. So everything we talk about as consultants applies to you as an IT person internally. We know that, but I wanted to make that explicit.
Yes, if you've ever worked for a reseller or whatever. Anyway, perhaps that's a conversation for another day. Thank you so much for listening to Heavy Strategy. Thanks very much to Johna. Johna, where can they find you?
Come join us at Nemertes.com. We have a community specifically for heavy strategy folks. So go hit the website, sign on to the community. Greg and I hang out there. We've got all our episodes there and we have discussions around those episodes.
And you can find me over on LinkedIn. I'm steadily abandoning Twitter X as it becomes, just this week, you won't find any tweets going out onto our properties because Elon's made that impractical going forward. So you'll find us much more on LinkedIn going forward where you can engage with us there. Thanks very much for listening. Remember that the show that gives you the right questions but not the right answers. The problems and the answers to the questions are your problem, not ours. Thanks for listening. See you in a couple of weeks.